we haven't stopped having dreams and visions. We're just fragmented them and channeled them into very cheap forms of that, right? We turn now to other places for us to have dreams and visions, and they're almost always secondhand.
We live in a time when the old maps seem to be failing. And there's a deep collective ache to learn another way to live with one another. You just heard a slice of what's to come in today's conversation. Welcome. I'm David Achata. As an executive coach and author, I've spent my career helping people navigate change. But to go forward, we often have to look back. I created this season to explore how Indigenous wisdom can help us grow into the people our future needs. And whether you're looking for personal healing, better leadership, a deeper faith, or a new way to dream, I'm glad you're here. We're widening this circle this season to rediscover what it means to walk in a good way. So welcome to the How People Grow podcast season 6. Today, my guest is Damian Costello, and I've developed acquaintance with Damian over this last year, and he's going to be sharing with us on the subject of visions and why they matter today. And he is a scholar of Black Elk. And so, Damian, tell us a little bit about who you are, your work, and why Black Elk is so important to you.
Hi, David. Thanks for hosting me.
Yeah.
I'm a Roman Catholic theologian, and I have the great privilege of working for an Indigenous organization, NAIITS, an Indigenous Learning Community. NAIITS used to be an acronym, North American Institute of Indigenous Theological Studies, but that's a very long and pretentious sounding name and not really reflective of who we are. So we kept that because that's how people know us, NAIITS, but added an Indigenous Learning Community. And what we do is we offer a Ph.D. and 4 master's degrees in theological studies from an Indigenous perspective. So intersection of Indigenous spiritualities and Christian traditions and healing and all of the great stuff we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, man, I'm excited to hear about him.
And, part of my work, what brought me to NAITS was my lifelong interest in Nicholas Black Elk, who was a Lakota holy man, a medicine man. So he was born before the reservation era, about 1867, but we don't really know the exact year because of, weren't exactly the same kind of records that we have in Western society. He was second cousin of Crazy Horse, was at all kinds of different iconic events, just had this real talent or gift for being in places that mattered. He was at the Battle of Little Bighorn. He was at the Battle of Wounded Knee or the Massacre of Wounded Knee, toured Europe with Buffalo Bill Cody. And, the most important part of his life that, be the center of our conversation is he had this great vision when he was a young boy.
Damian, thanks for the introduction and the overview. Before we get into Black Elk's story, I want to back up just a tad. And you mentioned your Roman Catholic background and your lifelong interest in Black Elk. Will you tell us, how does a Roman Catholic come to be interested in Black Elk? Will you guide us a little bit on your journey?
Oh, sure. I would say that my interest in Black Elk is representative of what I think is a very common interest in Native Americans, Native American history, Indigenous peoples, by non-Indigenous people. I'm not Indigenous. I'm mostly Polish, a little Irish. But ever since I was a boy growing up in Vermont, I wandered through the woods and wondered how people survived and yearned to live in the old ways, right? I was a Boy Scout, went camping, and I always knew that, people survived here without all the sort of extra technology that we have that oftentimes is a source for destroying that natural world. And I yearn to have that deep connection. And so that was my whole life. I went to college, was avoiding work in the library and pulled a book off the shelf, and it was Black Elk Speaks, which is the story of the first 25 years of his life and what made him famous. And I happened to bring that into my theology class, and the professor saw that and he said, "Oh, Damian, great book." And so I said, "Oh, yeah, it's wonderful. I loved it. Yeah, it just captured my imagination in so many different ways." And then he said, "Did you know he was Catholic?"
Hmm.
And so that added this whole extra layer of really mystery to me, because I was Catholic, but never had really thought about that overlap. Like, why would a medicine man, a holy man with this great vision, why would he have become Catholic? And so that really spoke to me and my sort of love of both of these traditions and ways of life. And
Hmm.
ever since then, I just sank more and more into his life, and I guess have followed his lead in terms of the spiritual journey.
Hmm. Thanks for sharing that. I think what will make this conversation really interesting is that I don't know a lot of about Black Elk. I only recently was able to read through Black Elk Speaks, and my mind was just really blown at the story of this young man getting sick and having a vision. And I had to reread it a few times to get
Hmm.
it, like, what is going
Yeah.
on here?
Hmm.
And so because I don't know a lot about Black Elk, it'll enable me to be really curious about this. And so my questions may be off. So please feel free to help me ask better questions if it's,
Hmm.
appropriate. But the reason I wanted to do this particular interview was because of the role that dreams and visions play in Native worldviews. For those of us who are in a predominantly Western worldview, we think about dreams just as kind of this weird subconscious thing that happens, because we ate something like too much pasta, or something like that
Hmm.
before bed.
Hmm.
And we don't spend a lot of time digging in to figure out what is happening here. And so, we come to the life of this young man who goes into this vision. Tell us a little bit about the role visions play in the Native American worldview, and how did this vision come to Black Elk, and therefore, what were the vision's implications?
Well, so visions and dreams are just such an essential part of, most, I'd probably say all, I don't know all indigenous traditions, but all that I'm familiar with, and in particular the Lakota tradition. People were expected to have visions. That was sort of a normal part of life, but it was also sort of actively sought and cultivated. And so, particularly young people in rites of passage ceremonies. So, probably most people have heard of the Vision Quest, the Hamblecha, where a young person, and not only a young person, but definitely teenagers, were brought out to a remote place that was done in ceremony. So they were guided by their elders, usually go through the sweat lodge, counseled about what to expect. And they would go to this remote place by themselves and pray and fast for anywhere from 1 to 4 days. And the idea was that, okay, we would say you would have a vision, but they would understand that as the spirits would see you. They would recognize that you were humbling yourself. So you prayed and fasted. The idea is that they would have pity. And in fact, the ideal is that you would cry. You would cry because tears were the most sincere form of prayer.
Hmm.
In the Lakota language, to pray and to cry comes from the same root.
Hmm.
And so the spirits would notice you and come to you and give you a gift to bring back to the people that would sort of characterize your life. And it could be something sort of straightforward, like Crazy Horse had a vision that gave him power in war. So he was like impervious to enemy fire. But then there was like bigger and more ambiguous visions. Um, there were oftentimes new ceremonies were given in vision in this way. And then there was these higher callings to uh, healing power and just a form of leadership that might not be very well defined. And so Black Elk had sort of all of those things. He didn't have, well, he did have sort of this power in battle that he had this very conflicted relationship to, but he was given this very high calling through his vision that he just spent his whole life trying to live into and interpret, and ultimately never really felt that he had landed in its fullness, right? That he was always there was something always more to it that he was seeking after.
Hmm. So what happened? I remember from reading the book, he was a young man and he was sick. And walk us through this
Mhm.
vision and what it meant for him, and maybe even here we are today in 2026, and why a vision like this might matter for us.
Yeah. Well, he was a the vision started at least a year, maybe a couple years before he actually had it.
Okay.
He's hearing voices that as he was outside by himself, right? The birds would call to him and he would hear them saying, "The time is now. Um, the sacred voice is calling you." And he would hear that and he would know there was something, it was pregnant, that there was something both ominous and beautiful to this, but he didn't know what it meant, and it sort of scared him. So as opposed to the sort of standard process, right? If you're a teenager, you're being prepared for this, you're going through ceremony, people are guiding you. And when you have a vision, then it's interpreted. But Black Elk didn't have any of this. This sort of came to him at a very young age without him asking for it. And so I think he was about 9 years old. They were following the buffalo traditional way. And this is actually right near the site of the Battle of Little Bighorn, though it was later on, a number of years later. He got sick. He stopped for a drink of water, and he sort of couldn't get up. He sort of collapsed, and so they called his family over. They set up a teepee. They laid him down, and he went into what we would call a coma for 12 days.
Hmm.
And so during this time, he remembered being going out of the teepee and two men descending with wings, and he getting on a little cloud that was next to him. They brought him up into the sky, and all the different nations, the horse nations danced for him. They brought him to the cloud teepee of the six grandfathers who represented the six powers of the universe, east, south, west, north, Mother Earth and Father Sky. And they said, "Nephew, grandson, this is time. You're called to save your people. They need you." And they gave him these gifts: sacred pipe, flowering stick, a cup of water, and they sent him down the black road first, the black road of death, of suffering. And at the end, he defeated the blue man who had been oppressing his people, drought. And then he led his people down the sacred red road to the sacred hoop where he planted the flowering tree. And this became the center of his nation, and it sort of renewed all of creation. And he looked around and he saw all the different nations of the world, and he said, "I didn't know at first if I saw white people." And he was kind of joking, I think, to the John Neihart, white guy who was interviewing him. He said, "But you guys were there too." So it was this vision of complete cosmic flourishing, particularly for his people. And then they brought him back to the teepee and they said, "All right, nephew, now you know what to do." And they send him back to Earth. And there's this very poignant moment where he's walking across the plains by himself to his teepee. He looks inside, and there he is, laying down, and his family's around him, and they think that he's died, right? And they're sort of preparing for that. But so Black Elk walks in, and he wakes up, and people were mystified and overjoyed. But there was a man there who saw him, and Black Elk said, "I think he knew something had happened, but he was too scared to say anything." Black Elk, he didn't know what to do. And he knew that like visions like this entailed the calling to be at the very least a medicine man, which is a very high calling, but entails a lot of suffering, right? Even today, they say, if you don't have this calling, don't ask for it. And if you have this calling and you don't accept it, you're required to give up that which is most important to you, the spirits will take from you. So it's sort of very fraught. But Black Elk spent the next few years of his life running from this. He didn't know what to do, and he was very scared.
So he has this vision. It's pretty epic. He starts to see the implications of it for him and his people, and he runs. Why is it that he is running away from this?
The spirit world is um, it's powerful, right? And even when you have direct access to it and you don't have guidance, it's overwhelming.
Hmm.
And he didn't know how to ask for help. And of course, there's a lot going on. This is the Great Sioux Wars. They're fighting the U.S. Army. Shortly, a few years after this, was the Battle of Little Bighorn, and he was given a six-shooter by his aunt, and he killed a couple wounded soldiers. He was told to, which was sort of traumatic for him as a 12-year-old boy. And then he followed Sitting Bull up to Canada as refugees. Right, this is after the U.S. Army tripled the war effort after the massacre or the defeat of Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So he was there for 4 years, very tough years, and then finally surrendered uh, after those 4 years as he was walking back to Pine Ridge. So, like, I think I saw 800 miles.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, it's sort of also a mystery, right? Like, there's, I think, this sense that we're all called very dramatically, and we're also called very consistently in small ways. And how often do we ignore that, right?
Yeah.
In so many different ways. Um, but finally, so as this is all going on, the spirits are continuing to pursue him. They don't go away. And he starts to get overwhelmed by this. Like, he's hearing this in the thunder. The voices, they're still calling to him. Now is the time. Now is the time. And his family thinks he's losing his mind. And so they call the medicine man in, and they sit him down with Black Elk. And Black Elk finally sort of surrenders. And he says, like, he tells him the whole story. And the medicine man is um, also overwhelmed. He said, I have never heard a vision like this before. And so we have to reenact this. They say that when you receive a vision, you have to, um, the spirits can come to you at any time, but you need to respond in ceremony. That's the only way you can do that.
Huh.
And so they reenacted the entire vision as the village that was there, this refugee village, everything down to the horse nations and the journey down the red road and the cloud teepee of the six grandfathers.
Wow. Okay, so I've got to ask a personal question here.
Mhm.
So you know this story, and you know this tradition of reenacting your dreams, which, I have so many thoughts about that. I have done something like this before, but I'm wondering, have you participated in any ceremonies where you're enacting your dreams like this?
Not like that. Um, the ceremonies that I participated in are reenacting the dreams that other people have had, right? And you could talk about that in different levels, but so take the Sundance. Uh, that was given in a dream. And that's a story Black Elk tells, right? We always think of the Sundance as like there's nothing more Lakota than the Sundance. Well, there was a time when there's Lakota did not have the Sundance because they were living in the woods by the Great Lakes, and they came out into the plains once they got horses and guns. But
Hmm.
they became very weak, and the spirits saw this, and so they came to Kablaya, just another sort of humble person, and gave him a vision of this new ceremony so that they would survive and thrive in this new place, that they would make relatives with the buffalo. So that's what the Sundance is all about. So whenever the Sundance is um, performed, you're reenacting that dream that the spirits gave in order that the people may survive. And so you can sort of apply that in other contexts. Like, I'm Catholic. When I go to the Mass, like, that is a very real, like, sort of dream, at least the way I see it, that Christ enacted and brought to us that we may flourish and survive.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so my own personal dreams, I guess I've never really done it exactly that way, other than maybe on a very personal level, right?
Hmm.
Um,
It's super interesting, Damien, to be thinking about reenacting a dream. And I know that there was a time when you lived on a reservation. Were you able to see something like this on the reservation?
So I don't know if I wouldn't have seen it as directly this and explicitly as you're articulating. But what I would witness and be a part of is how dreaming would be sort of cultivated and explored within the ceremony.
Hmm.
So I went to a lot of peyote ceremonies, Native American church, right? And so the idea of that is it's an all-night prayer ceremony where there's the roadman, the leader is facilitating prayer for a particular person. Like there's always a person that the prayer meeting is conducted for, and people ritually take peyote, but it's such a skillful communal dream that occurs really,
Hmm.
where the person is bringing forward either a particular struggle or a particular challenge they're facing or something that they're moving into or a celebration of a birthday or something.
Hmm.
And in those prayers and the medicine, a sort of new dream is created. And maybe old dreams are sort of processed as part of that. So it's not to say that there was a specific dream that was there enacted, like maybe Black Elk in the Lakota context, but that at the center of what's happening is really is a dream.
Hmm. Wow. That is something I have never thought of. I'm not familiar with peyote ceremonies, but what I'm envisioning is the gathering around a person who has a need. And with the medicine of peyote, the community is helping this person. What is it? Is it find direction, find answers? How would you describe it?
It could be all of that. Healing, um, definitely healing would be probably the biggest thing that I saw it focused on. Like oftentimes, uh, what peyote as a medicine seemed to have been most powerful in addressing is addiction issues.
Hmm.
So many people that I interacted with attribute the Native American church, that way of life, that prayer, and that medicine with healing them from very deep and powerful addiction.
Hmm.
And I know maybe some of the listeners, maybe not your listeners, but people in general would be very confused and they'd say, oh, peyote, like, isn't that another form of addiction or isn't that just a drug? And I would just say from my experience, all I saw was healing and connection and sort of powerful new ways of life that was connected to these ceremonies and
Hmm.
these communities.
Yeah. Yeah, you bring up something that I think is probably really essential here, which is the reason I'm creating this particular set of conversations for this podcast season. It's this idea of indigenous wisdom for us today, what we could learn. And we're touching on this, the role of ceremonies to help people integrate. And when you look at how like going back to Black Elk, how his community was able to help him reenact this vision to integrate. How do you see that helped him figure out how to move forward with it?
He was a totally different person. I mean, whatever we think of how this occurred, um, whatever language or sort of frameworks we try to analyze it, there's no question that beforehand he was a fractured, um, sort of broken person. And in the aftermath, he became whole, but not just whole, like a community leader, this sort of new center of gravity for his community. So he was overnight, he became a medicine man, a healer, and
Hmm.
using his gifts to heal people of particular illnesses. Now, he also had, as part of this calling, this much broader um, vocation or side to it to explore that was not only just for individuals, not only for his community or his tribe, but that was sort of universal in scope. Um, and he spent his whole life leaning into that more. So, for example, a couple years after he got back to Pine Ridge or settled on Pine Ridge. This is him settling on the reservation for the first time. He had the opportunity to go to Europe with the Wild West show, which was actually a pretty good paying job, and a big adventure for the performers. It was complicated, um, performing in these big European and American cities, but they were celebrities. Back at home, you had to cut your hair and starting to undergo all of this different uh, cultural persecution and genocide. Well, you were a celebrity. You were sort of at the center of these arenas with tens of thousands of people. But he said, I wanted to go there not just because of all that, because I wanted to visit the white world and sort of learn from the inside and to see what wisdom I could bring back, what power I could bring back to my people that they may live. There was this constant pattern of him
Mm.
looking to every corner to help his people like flourish, to live in this new, incredibly challenging context, um, and constantly sort of uh, relying on his vision to be in that point, that position of leadership, which, especially in that context, is very, very challenging.
It's really fascinating to go back to this time and try to understand this man who chooses to go into this white Western world to understand it. And can you share what would that have been like? What would have been the points of difference that he would have noticed? Because you have on one hand this life he came from where there's the value of dreams and visions. There's a help from the community to reenact it, to help them figure out how do you integrate this. And he goes on this Wild West tour show. And what does he discover in this world that he's able to learn from and take back?
It's probably the last thing you'd think of, um, and it's sort of what brings me back to that original story of that question my professor posed to me. Did you know he was Catholic? And I'll boil this down very concisely and not get bogged down in it. But what he ironically found was that a Christocentric spirituality, right? This love of the other, an other that's outside of your tribe, that's not like you, that's often found in the suffering, that actually was an insight that helped him to understand the humanity of the people who had conquered him.
Hmm.
And not in the sense of like to validate what had happened, because he remained one of the most powerful voices against the tragedy that Indigenous peoples faced and continue to face. But that there's a core humanity or core um, shared humanity that we all have. Um, that sort of we're all relatives. We're all relatives with the earth and the beings of the earth, and that sort of added to a spirituality that sort of this new Christian aspect that didn't replace anything, but just added another layer to this incredibly deep spirituality.
Hmm.
And ironically and sadly, a lot of those Christians he encountered couldn't understand his tradition, the value in dreams of visions, like what we're talking about here, with the same sympathy and depth that he was able to afford to them.
Hmm. So he goes in and he's able to see within the Christian worldview, I mean, really the best of it, which is to be able to see outside and care for the outsider. He's also able to see the dissonance, like, oh, I don't see the alignment here.
Mhm.
You
Exactly.
you conquered us.
Mhm.
And from from your work and studying of his life, how is he able to make sense of this and become Catholic?
Well, to like cut to the chase and skip all kinds of ambiguity and complication, he's able to do that because of the deep spiritual integration and calling that he received as a young boy. Um,
Hmm.
and that's how does he do anything that he was able to do? Like, how do you live in a reservation when you once were free in the plains, following the buffalo, the lords of the plains, the Lakota were referred to as, and now prisoners on the reservation, right? And how do you do that in a way with dignity and perseverance in the face of like the slow drip of oppression? So,
Mm-hmm.
like one little detail that I think is so important is that the Lakota were actually very successful cattle ranching early on. It's not that different than hunting buffalo. They just now live with you. And Black Elk had 60 head of cattle early on. But these processes that moved the good land to white ranchers and corrupt BIA officials out of indigenous hands, and then land degradation and all sorts of different things. He was left with one head of cattle
Mm.
when NAIIHART came to interview him in the early 1930s, right? Um, but it's because he had that sort of direct access to the spirits, to the creator, and continually he had learned that way of listening to his dreams, integrating them, responding to them, and understanding that that was a continual process. He had numerous visions throughout his life, including during the ghost dance, who he called the Son of God, Wanikia, he who makes live, who he saw as Jesus Christ.
Mm.
Um,
So, did he encounter Jesus in his visions?
another long thing to unpack, but
Yeah.
the ghost dance was actually an indigenous reception of Christianity. If you take sort of a big picture of this story. So the original, the founder of the ghost dance, Wovoka, who was a Paiute in Nevada, he had been very influenced by Mormons, and he had a vision where very explicitly Christ said, I came to the white people first and they killed me. I'm coming back to the Indians.
Mm.
I'm coming back as an Indian, and I'm going to do all those things the book of Revelations talk about. I'm going to bring back the dead. I'm going to heal the land. And all you have to do is dance this new dance, live in peace with the white people, send your kids to the school, and go to church. Like it actually taught you need to go to church too. And so this sort of radiates, it's like an explosion in the Great Basin and the Great Plains, ironically, through kids who had gone through the residential school system because they had friends on other reservations. They knew how to ride the train, they could send letters. And the name in Lakota for the ghost dance Messiah, who was going to come back, was Wanikia, which was the term that the Christians, the Catholics, and the Protestants used for Savior. And so Black Elk, when he's in a Catholic church, and other Lakota people became Episcopalians or Presbyterians, when they're in those contexts and they're reading their Lakota Bible or praying or singing songs, and when they're at the ghost dance, they're saying Wanikia. This is the same figure. And there's actually a correlation with participating in the ghost dance and becoming an active member in the church sort of after, during, and then after the ghost dance phenomenon.
So, your membership in the church was connected to the ghost dance.
It was encouraged, like it wasn't that there's some sort of requirement, and not everybody did. Oh, and so to land this plane, Black Elk, very such a fascinating confluence. When he was in Europe, he wrote back a number of letters, and one of them said he had hoped to go visit the Holy Land because he wanted to see the Holy Land for himself, to learn more about this Jesus guy, to sort of experiment. That's one thing about Black Elk. He always, if he had some sort of religious idea, spiritual idea, he put it into practice. He investigated. He says, I didn't have the money. So he came back home. And just as he gets home to Pine Ridge, the ghost dance shows up. And he hears about it. And he's like, well, I don't know. It's not really, I don't think it's my vision. But he goes and investigates. And he says, actually, their dance around this pole, which represents a tree, is a lot like my vision. So he tries it out. And during that, he has the last sort of major vision of his life where he's raised up. He flies over the promised land and comes to the sacred tree where there's 12 men surrounding a man with long hair, eagle feather in his hair, and
Hmm.
pierced hands.
Hmm.
He says, "Everything has been given to me by my Father, and you must say that." And so he goes back, becomes a leader in the ghost dance. But that becomes, from my perspective, his calling from Wanikia that he then enacts in baptism, right? That just like he enacted his vision that he had as a young boy to become a medicine man with this whole village, I think that when he eventually accepted baptism, that was his acting out that particular vision.
Hmm. Hmm. What I'm hearing over and over again as you're sharing about Black Elk's life, for whatever reason, I keep coming back to this idea of acting out, like in a ceremonial way, like you are acting out the things that are coming to you. And what I'm wondering about is back to the subject of the role of visions and dreams and how do we integrate those. Um, and this is more of a personal question for you, but then we'll come back to Black Elk. What do you think is happening or has happened, Damien, right now in our culture where we have lost the reverence for the significance of dreams and visions? And so we just kind of operate reactively according to what we see or what we think. We're really locked up in our little tiny prefrontal cortex, rational mind. And I know there are plenty of people who have dreams but maybe don't give as much attention to them. But why do you think it is that as a culture,
Mm.
we don't give this much weight to dreams and visions?
Because we've been fooled. Um, we've lost the fullness of our humanity, and there's a lot of ways that's happened. I think for a number of centuries in the West, we've been given all of these sort of scientific and rationalist, very skeptical reasons to take our mind seriously. Like we have a lot of reasons to not think that what we think has any substance at all, that it's just a product of our brain chemistry, right?
Hmm.
Whether that's Freud, whether that's just taking a very thin reading of like neuroscience, right? Or just being locked in a scientific paradigm. But just think of the word we use. We use the word vision, which
Hmm.
is, it's not a bad word, other than it reinforces the tendency for us to think that would we have a dream or something, when we experience something like Black Elk, what we're doing is we're thinking about what's happening in our brain. When we think about a dream, it's what's inside our skull.
Hmm.
And for all of human history, all of that was just, that was the world. Right? Black Elk didn't think this is just something in his mind. He was brought to these places, and these spiritual realities reached out to him
Hmm.
and connected with him. And so the sort of experiment that I encourage people to work with, and this is what I do. It's like, we have these intuitions. Let's start maybe not with big, huge dreams and visions, because we don't always have those. But we do have these sort of constant sort of spiritual cues, right? Where we're called in a particular way and start responding ceremonially in maybe a small way. Like so much of indigenous life is about making offerings, whether that's to people or to other than human beings or the land itself. When you start doing that, it opens up this whole other realm that is always around us, but that you don't notice, or that we have intentionally sort of shut the blinds to and plugged our ears and said, that's not for us to listen to.
Hmm. One thing that stands out to me listening to you is you said just a minute ago that we're taught in our culture that these things are happening inside of our heads. But what Black Elk believed, as did many of his peers and many people from this different worldview, that reality came after him. Like what was real came after him. It was something
Mhm.
outside of his skull. And to me, it brings up this idea of getting in touch with what is real
Mhm. Yes.
versus what's in your head. And I honestly, I feel kind of at a loss as much as I am trying in my own way, and I've tried to develop practices to get in touch with what is real. I'm at a loss to even know how to ask the question of something to the effect of, how do you think Black Elk integrated what was real? And maybe a follow-up question is to build back on what we talked about just a second ago, is how can we get more in touch with what is real? So will you take us
Mhm.
back to Black Elk and how he was able to integrate that vision that, or, the reality that came after him?
Mhm. So, big question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe one place to start that comes to mind uh, for us, and then to get to Black Elk and remind me to get back there. But ancestors, right? We all have ancestors. We all have ancestors that have passed that we know, that we remember. And are they still there? Like, I think our natural tendency, despite all kinds of different cultural voices, um, and I'm talking about like our modern, postmodern, consumerist, virtual voices, reductionist voices, is that now that's just in your head. It's memories, it's brain chemistry. Oh, no, are they still there in some way? Are they present in some way? And open yourself up to the possibility that they are, and that they reach out to you and they connect to you in certain ways. And maybe not super dramatic ways, right? Probably not Black Elk Vision ways, but in ways that show you that they're not gone.
Hmm.
And that to me is just, if you open yourself up to that or something like that, that's just a sort of a slight glimmer to this real world that is shimmering around us, right? I think as I've sunk more into sort of a, what I would say, authentic spirituality, right? Because we're raised in religious traditions and we may not really engage them very deeply or take them very seriously. And even if we do, we may not do that in a very deep tone. But as you adopt these practices that form you, I guess this is the other part I've maybe buried the lead a little bit. The biggest part of indigenous traditions that I've experienced, and particularly in Black Elk's case, is that they are demanding, right? It's not a matter of just sort of going for a walk in the woods and I get my native indigenous spiritual experience. You have to work hard and make sacrifice, whether that's intense fasting, um, extended prayer, even in Black Elk's cultural context, the offering of your very flesh in the Sundance.
Hmm.
And these practices open you up, put you in that liminal space um, where you start to see the real world very tangibly and open you up to experiences like Black Elk had.
That idea of putting yourself in a liminal space, I think, is foreign to many people. And it's interesting for those of us from a Christian background, which is many of us listening. If you just look back and you think about how Jesus operated, it makes sense. Like he's always praying behind the bushes. He's always engaging in really interesting ceremonial things. He's fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. I mean, you don't fast for 40 days and 40 nights and not go into a liminal trance like state. And it's interesting to me to think about some of these ceremonies that we're describing as putting yourself in that liminal space. And maybe that's some of the answer I'm looking for. As we today listening to this ask ourselves, well, what does that look like for me to connect with the real world? Maybe some of it has to do with putting yourself in that liminal space. What do you think of that idea?
I think that's the missing ingredient, or the ingredient that I don't think we either take seriously, we don't know about, or we don't want to do the work to get there. But if you go back to the Sundance, which Black Elk talked a lot about,
Hmm.
what is Sundance? Sundance is 4 days of praying and fasting. Well, there's a preparation that goes into it, many weeks. But 4 days of prayer and fasting. You're not drinking water, only what you need to survive, which is in his time probably nothing at all. You're not eating anything. You're dancing all day in the hot sun. And the high point then is you are pierced through the chest as a man, or if a woman in the shoulders. A little piece of wood is put under that flesh, little flap of skin. You're tied to a rope, which is then tied to the tree, and you dance until that flesh breaks away. And so you look at that from the outside, and particularly from a Christian background, and you say, that is awful, horrible suffering. That's brutal. It's unnecessary. And Christians say, oh, Jesus already paid all of that for us. We don't have to do that. But then if you actually are around it and you talk to people or you do it, you realize that through that process, you're both formed in this vision, right? This communal circle of making relatives to the buffalo and offering your flesh to the creator so that people may live. Your very flesh and blood. And that through the process, you are cycled up into this incredible power. Um, that the people who come out of that are almost literally glowing from what they went through. And it's the exact opposite. The result is the exact opposite of what we project onto it. Now, of course, this can always be abused, taken in negative ways, used to punish people. But when regulated by community in a culture that's been there for millennia, it does something that we rarely experience. And I think Indigenous people understand is necessary for full human flourishing.
Yeah, I think that you're touching on something that I did want to ask you about that relates to this, and it's how we struggle with in our day and age to see past what our eyes are showing us. And like you're talking about this ceremony where there's dancing and there's fasting and there's flesh tearing, and we could look at it logically and say this is crazy. However, Black Elk did talk about this concept of the spirit of a thing.
Mhm.
And maybe you could share with us, what does that mean and how does it apply to something like this ceremony?
Well, and this is a very sort of complicated, when you get down to the you know, Lakota terminology and like the higher spirituality of it all. So I'll do my best. And I don't claim to be any sort of expert. But the idea is, and the first part is, I think, familiar to most of your listeners, that everything has a spirit to it, right? In the natural world, has an essence. It's living in some sort of way, even if it's not living like a human being is living. So even what we would classify as non-animate, non-living objects like rocks have this sort of spiritual essence to them. And that doesn't mean everyone is alive in the same way. There's this great story that I think this is in a Ojibwe context. Anthropologists asked this medicine man, it's like, are all rocks alive? And the medicine man thought for a while and he said, no, but that one right over there is. That there are certain ones with greater personality,
Wow. Yeah.
personality that we would recognize, like a personhood. Um, but that different beings have a different spiritual potency to them, and that you often recognize them, or the best way to recognize it is their most defining characteristic. So, the medicine in a native context, a very common one is sage, right? And that is burned for the smoke to purify. And you can tell that because of its smell. It's a very kind of biting, acrid smell, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that smell is what it is. It's not that it's just some chemical that we associate with purification. Indigenous people would say, no, that's its sort of spiritual potency that exists within it. And when you burn it and release it and it washes over you, that enacts that power on you. So, no, we're not worshiping the sage. No, it's not a demon. It's just has energy given to it by the creator that does something specific.
Mm.
Just like human beings do lots of specific things, but one thing we do very well is we have language, like very differentiated language. That's one of our potencies.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm not sure if I'm landing this where you're asking, but in terms of the real world, from like a Lakota context, is that everything around you has that sort of not just sort of animacy and living potency to it, but a very specific kind to it.
Mm.
And so what you're doing in the world is you're making relatives with all these different beings and learning what they do and interacting with them and sort of calling on different ones when you need them, whether
Mm.
it's a very sort of straightforward way, like the buffalo. Well, they give you almost everything you need to survive. And so you have a very big ceremony for that, and you make offerings of yourself. The buffalo give themselves that the people may live. And so someone has to give their blood and flesh and reciprocity so that relationship continues.
Mm. Yeah.
And so at the center of all of this is relationship that you maintain with all of creation.
Mm. Man, that is so beautiful. I'm thinking about the rocks, that you just described a minute ago.
Hmm.
One of my guests in a future interview, I was talking to her before, and she was telling me that her father came to faith through a microscope.
Hmm.
He was a scientist, and when he saw that metal was moving,
Hmm.
he said, "There's got to be a God." And it's interesting because it sounds, I mean, the term people use today is woo woo, like, oh boy, like, essence,
Hmm.
rocks are alive, that kind of thing. But if you were to put it under a microscope, you would see these things are not still. And it's fascinating because I think that this world that we're describing saw that, whereas
Hmm.
we oftentimes miss it. Fun little story. I was talking to some of my son's friends the other day. They spent the night, and I woke them up and gave them some ceremonial cacao,
Hmm.
and they never had it. And I was talking to them about the ceremonies and the important conversations that happen around ceremonial cacao in Peru, where my father came from. And I was like, think of it like a personality. There's a personality that comes with this nut that's been roasted. It's like coffee. We know the personality of coffee when we pair it with our bodies. And a part of being connected to creation is knowing, when am I going to pair up with this? How am I going to say thank you? How am I going to respond to this? How am I going to interact with, acknowledge it's not just me in this world. I'm connected to all these things. So I love that story of rocks.
Could I jump
And
in and just say something real quick about coffee?
please, yeah.
To me, that is the best evidence that everyone who's listening and everyone from from people who are somewhat familiar with indigenous traditions to people who don't even know the word, that they understand medicine and they use it every day.
Yes.
Coffee is a medicine, and we
Uh-huh.
depend on it. We know what life is like without it. You hear people say, "Oh, I'm finally awake. I had my coffee." Or I haven't had my coffee. I'm a different person. And in Ethiopia, there's a whole ceremony for coffee. They
Oh, is there?
understood that there's a power to this that that means that it has to be sort of enacted and celebrated in community. And you drink, it's prepared and you drink as a group in a circle.
Hmm.
And
Wow.
to me, this is both an opportunity to sort of like open up what we're missing, right? We have the medicine, we take it, it's part of us. We don't have the ceremony. We don't understand where it comes from. We don't have that relationship. So it's not as if indigenous people are off doing something that's very different and they can go do their thing, but hey, we've evolved into something different. We still do the same things. We just don't know the deficit that we live in.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm so glad you said that. I think that the last question I want to ask you is related to that, and this is your opportunity, Damien, to the floor and give us your message, because because I think that that's the heart of why I wanted to make these conversations. Is I'm just aware how many people are not aware of the deficit at which they're living.
Mhm.
And so I thought of you because of your studying of Black Elk and his vision and his story and his connection to the quote real world. And as you look at the landscape today, what are some of the key lessons you think we can learn from Black Elk, in particular to the role of dreams and visions and why they matter for us so much today? Would you give us some of what you see those key lessons are?
So first, I would just say that Black Elk, um, there's very few people that I've encountered like him. Because when you think about his life and what he faced, the enormity of the change that he went through, his world was radically destroyed, and he reinvented himself over and over again, and was known as a person of humility, of love, of building bridges, of being able to connect with anyone around him. And I firmly believe like he was involved in me finding that book
Hmm. Hmm.
and thinking about these things, maybe seeing me in the woods, yearning for something, for connection,
Hmm.
lamenting the loss. And I think we're all in that place. And I think dreams and visions are the sort of glue and always have been to human community and the possibility of survival and flourishing. And we haven't stopped having dreams and visions. We're just fragmented them and channeled them into very cheap forms of that, right? We turn now to other places for us to have dreams and visions, and they're almost always secondhand.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I don't know what this takes. Probably takes many different forms, but I would say to listen to the voice that's calling you. That was the dominant reality in Black Elk's life. He just he was able to maybe hear it better than a lot of us. But I know in your daily life, you're having these conversations. You've been on these incredible journeys. You've learned so much in so many different areas because you are listening to that. And so I think that's a really important part is to have the courage of Black Elk to listen to those voices and take the risks to open yourself up to dreams and visions
Hmm.
and to challenge yourself, right? A lot of us can challenge ourselves physically. We work out really hard. Um, and I think it's time for us to relearn how to do that spiritually.
Hmm.
We're
Yes.
not working that part of our essence, and that's the deepest part of who we are. And that's what Indigenous people recognize, right? That the most important part of who you are and life, and the only reason why people are able to flourish is because they train that part of who they are, and they allow these long traditions and communities to do that to them.
Hmm. It's beautiful. Damian, thank you so much for being here. And it's been so rich, such a rich conversation. One of those I'm going to go back and re-listen to. And I'm sure that there are some people who are listening who'd like to find out more about you and your work. How could they find out about you and maybe some of the resources that you've produced?
Well, I guess I would say I've sort of a semi-hermit when it comes to, being online. I don't have Instagram, never had Facebook, nothing like that. I have articles out there you can find. Just Google my name. We can all be found very easily. I encourage you to check out NAIITS. That's NAIITS, an Indigenous Learning Community. And that's where my colleagues, mostly Indigenous, are sort of thinking about these things and, more importantly, working to be the healing in Indigenous communities and the rest of the world that we so desperately need.
Beautiful, Damian. Thanks again for being here.
Thanks, David.
So I want to say thanks to the folks at NAITS for the last few interviews. And thanks to Damian. That was such an amazing conversation about the role of visions as a way to see what's possible, these pulls from the quote, what we call the real world. So we're going to shift now to a new set of voices. In our next episode, we're going to be asking this question about how do we integrate these truths into our very selves. So to help us with this, I reached out to eco-psychologist and Pacha philosopher Lorena Saavedra Smith. She's going to join us about reweaving the broken soul and the practical and spiritual processes of awakening your roots. Lorena is a new friend. She is mi hermana peruana, my Peruvian sister, so I'm looking forward to introducing her to you. If this conversation has been helpful to you, go on over and support us at Substack. You can drop us a couple bucks a month and get in on a monthly conversation with some like-minded people, or you can leave us a review. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next week for Lorena Saavedra Smith and Reweaving the Broken Soul.
Said I will fly with you. Won't you fly